it's time to get into the big picture. We had a guest on the stream yesterday, of course, Leonardo, so I didn't really get to hone in on all the aspects that I wanted to get to. Not that I'm complaining, I didn't have a problem, it's fine to do that, but really what I was thinking was a big picture analysis and getting into topics that nobody else is really talking about. And this always happens when we have these high profile events that everybody just dissects it and they never put it in a big context. They never give the big picture, the meta political picture. This is, of course, one of the biggest political ASS events in decades, since maybe even in the last, maybe back to JFK. Yes, America has, a long history of political assassinations, but most countries do. Of course, World War I is kicked off by the secret society, the Black Hand, which was a Serbian nationalist movement, probably manipulated. It seems like it was manipulated to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand for a radical political nationalist agenda in that case. And some people think it was engineered by British intelligence. The Fabian Socialist Milner Rothschild Group does have an interest in that regard to World War I, which was also aided by another fake flag event, the sinking of the Lusitania. So really in political life, in nation state or imperial life, this is actually the norm. This is what happens in most countries, I would say. So I don't know why I saw people saying that this is some sort of unique American phenomenon. That's not true at all. This was something that might be a sea change, right? This might be an event that completely changes a lot of people's attitudes about the left, about being browbeaten into tolerance, into all the stuff that the opposition, that the ops has no concern for. They have no concern for equality, fairness, or any of that stuff. The left is, of course, a manipulated entity for larger power elites to push a bigger agenda. So what is that bigger agenda? Let's get into some of the topics that we haven't really delved into in a long time, going way back. We're going to go way back and get a bigger picture. I will be talking about some of the edgy things today. So be prepared and be ready to have your hearts and your feelings hurt. Let's go back to Tragedy and Hope, and we're going to walk through in a kind of an overview summary way. I mean, it's going to take a while. We're going to be here at least probably another couple of hours, a little short of 2 hours. And we're going to walk through the basics of Tragedy and Hope, because as you guys know, we did about 10 years ago a lecture series through the totality of the text. And to date, I'm the only person that's done an entire 16-ish hour lecture series through this absolutely essential geopolitical tome. Why is it so important? Carroll Quigley was a war historian, and he was the handler, the mentor, you could say, to Bill Clinton. So when Bill Clinton went to Georgetown, and when I think most people think it's pretty likely that Bill Clinton had some degree of association or participation in the CIA, this seems very natural with his connection to Georgetown and with his connection to Professor Carroll Quigley. Quigley actually has several books that are very revelatory. It's not just Tragedy and Hope, of course, it's also The Anglo-American Establishment. And it's also, he's got a book, History and Evolution of Civilizations, analyzing it from a geostrategic standpoint. Quigley represents a member of that WASP establishment of the Eastern Seaboard elite back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So we have to understand, first of all, that he is a apologist for the establishment. he's writing the book Tragedy and Hope to argue that the two world wars that happened in the 20th century and the Cold War, which this book was published in the midst of the Cold War, I think in the 1960s, 1966 is when it was first published, that the establishment was offering what he thought was the best hope for the world, which was democratic capitalism. Perhaps democratic capitalism could be the hope for a war-torn world after a century of conflicts and so many who had been unalived from war. Carroll Quigley doesn't seem to have too much of a concern on the side of the issue of Israel and Zionism, but keep in mind this was in the 1960s, so at this point foreign influence in the U.S. was not as strong or as powerful as it was. So anytime I talk about this, it's always people who've never read these texts who assume that me talking about this means that I don't want to talk about foreign nation state or Middle Eastern nation state, AIPAC, etc. This was written before that, and you do get stronger levels of influence in the U.S. after the Cold War in varying degrees and in varying capacities. So that really has nothing to do with what these books are about, even though these books do discuss the role of the Rothschilds in the history of banking in Europe and in the UK. And they also discuss the role of, Lord Rothschild, Balfour, etc., in the establishment of the nation state of Israel, all of which I've lectured about from the actual historic texts that no one else talks about. Who else lectures from and talks about Moses Hess's own books? Not many people that I've seen. So the people that are always fussing and bitching and critiquing don't actually listen to or know what we talk about on this channel. And it gets really annoying and frustrating. And the other bad part is that we live in this era when everybody wants everything in some tweet, one sentence, two sentence slogan format. Nobody is going to read this book. I've never met another person except for one or two guys on the internet who've read this entire text. So don't lecture me about what the book's about and what's really going on and all this stuff when you haven't read these things. Like, you have to do the requisite reading material before I will respect you enough to listen to you to tell me where I'm wrong when you haven't read these things. Now, did you know that Quigley in Anglo-American Establishment talks about Kalergi? He talks about the Kalergi plan being adopted by the Royal Society. They listened to two plans. One was from Lord Lionel Curtis, the Commonwealth of God plan, which was the world federal socialist type of structure that ended up being adopted, and the Kalergi plan. And so it seems that there's a blending of these two plans that they've adopted. I've talked about this actually going all the way back to 2009, 10, 11, but people just don't know and they don't hear, and they don't really care. They just want to argue and bitch. The book begins, though, not where you would expect. The book begins with 1776 and the role of banking elites. The relationships of governments were always in terms of of banks and currency controllers with governments were always in monetary terms and not real terms, since they were always obsessed with the stability of monetary exchanges. They had thus the ability. Let me rephrase that. Between one country's money and another, they use their power and their influence to do two things: to get all the money and debts expressed in terms of strictly limited commodity, ultimately a gold standard, and then to get all the monetary matters out of the control of the governments and into the hands of private banks. So he begins the book by telling you that the control structure, going all the way back to the times of East India Company and even the American Revolution, was due to private banking power, fiat gold note power, fractional reserve banking based around gold notes. If you had read the first few hundred pages of Tragedy and Hope, for example, that might have prompted you to know and understand why Bitcoin would have such a strong value proposition. So the people that talk to me about why this is all stupid, Bitcoin is dumb, right away I can kind of tell, well, then you really haven't read Tragedy and Hope, because you would be into Bitcoin if you understood the first few hundred pages. But he talks about really the history of Western civilization up to 1914. And he's at great pains to explain how it is that the banking elite fund and foster revolutions. And he begins the next chapter discussing Russia and why the West, particularly what's called the Anglo-American establishment, or really the old UK great game warfare against the Russian Empire. Why is that? Well, it's one of their main rivals. And he says Russia, when it saw itself as the third Rome, this necessitated on the part of the West, strategically he's arguing, the desire. Hey, Jamie, did you make me a coffee with honey in it? The allergies are going crazy here. Thank you. I don't have a cup. Since Russia saw itself as the third Rome, continuing the Orthodox Byzantine Catholic civilizational model, the structure that would have to be set up would be to oppose that. And thus we get what's called the Great Game, the classic battle between the UK, the British Empire, and Russia 100 plus years ago. The book then discusses what we might call the real Illuminati. And who makes up the Illuminati? Rothschilds, Rhodes, Ruskin, Milner, etc. This group, known as the Circle of Initiates, headed up by Lord Rothschild and others, and executed through their helpers and the Association of Helpers, eventually adopted a strategy of Fabian socialism. And Quigley talks about this, as do all the other texts that we cover for so many years. Next, he discusses the character of Benjamin Disraeli and how Disraeli really helped to set the stage for the move that these individuals would take. Now, it's true that not everybody in the British elite power structure necessarily agreed with the ideas and the motivations behind the Milner Circle. Some of the people in the Cliveden set, the Astors and other, they were more genuinely right-wing. They didn't believe in Bolshevism. They probably had monarchist type views, etc., traditional type views, but they didn't really end up having the final say. And that's obviously not the way the things in the UK went. He does say, however, that Benjamin Disraeli was working as an operative on behalf of the Rothschilds to secure the Suez Canal. Disraeli's purchase with Rothschild money of the Suez Canal for £3,680,000 happened in 1875 and was motivated by concern for the British communications with India and the British acquisition of the Cape of Good Hope. And I'll read this section here because this is relevant to what I said. The London Times has been owned by the Astor family since the 1920s. The Rhodes Rothschild Milner Group was sometimes spoken of as the Cliveden set, named after the Astor country house where they would sometimes meet. They also established several influence networks and groups in universities, including the chairs of imperial affairs and international relations. Some of these were set up as the Bayet Chair at Oxford, the Montagu Burton Chair at Oxford, and the Rhodes Chair at London, hence the Rhodes Scholars. This is where it originates from. As well as the Stevenson's Chair at Chatham House. This eventually influences the Rhodes House at Oxford. From 1884 to 1915, the members of this group worked valiantly to extend the British Empire and organize its federal system. So it was not originally necessarily a totally socialist project at this stage. Now, Ruskin was, as I understand, a socialist. So there were elements of influence of socialism. Lord Curtis's idea of the Commonwealth of God might not have been totally a Fabian socialist model, and many of those people, as I said, did disagree with socialism. But the attempt to expand the British Empire and bring America back under the British Empire, which was this early phase during the period of Cecil Rhodes, that failed. So this group, this network, went back to the drawing board and set up another strategy and another attempt, another method and means of their power and their control. It goes on to talk about Rhodes Kindergarten, Cecil Rhodes's structure, and this is where we get the roundtable groups: the Royal Institute for National Affairs, Chatham House, and then what we get in the U.S. is what's called Pratt House, which is modeled on that, which is where we get the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, and all those organizations that the Carnegie and Rockefeller families helped to really set up in the U.S. And they set it up intentionally as the mirror model for the U.S. So it's not, strictly speaking, a British Empire strategy. That was the old Rhodes plan. That shifted when that all crumbled and failed and the UK went bankrupt. But what came to the fore, what rose to the fore, was this Fabian socialist model and approach, again, supported by these people, particularly Lord Rothschild and others. In regard to the two world wars, Quigley says that this served the money power, the banking elite, and he all but says that it was sort of strategized and planned. He doesn't come all the way out directly and say that, but he does talk about odd events around the sinking of the Lusitania. He says, for example, there was a mysterious second explosion after the German torpedo struck. This vessel, which was declared unsinkable, went down in 18 minutes. The propaganda agencies of the Entente powers made full use of this occasion. The Times of London announced that 4/5 of the passengers were U.S. citizens. This drags then the U.S. into the conflict. The British manufactured and distributed a medal which they pretended was awarded to the submarine crew by the German government. So the British strategists and spies and propagandists were creating fake propaganda that dupes the Americans to come into this conflict, as they will actually do in the next war as well. So that's standard fare for the perfidious Albion. Then we get the, as a result of this, the 14 points plan and the rise of the figures in the U.S. right around this time, right? World War I, Federal Reserve, right? 1913, 1917, Bolshevik Revolution, all of that is occurring at this time when the U.S. sees this sudden explosion amongst its elites and its government class of open socialists. So for the first time, for example, we have a Fabian socialist president, Woodrow Wilson, who's handled by Colonel Edwin Mandel House, who happens to be handled by this same Fabian socialist Rothschild power structure. That's not accidental. That is by design. And this is exactly when we get the Federal Reserve private banking structure set up that is the perfect parallel of the Rothschild banking model in the UK, the Bank of England, and in France with the Rothschild-run Mirabeau Bank of France. I think it's also called the Paribas system. I was scrolling back through some of the Tragedy and Hope stuff, and I had forgotten some of these terms. But this also becomes the model after Bretton Woods for the Bank for International Settlement, right? I'm not sure why that it's not listed on here as to, I mean, there's a whole section on it in Quigley. I'll show it to you in a minute, but it's not really I guess, I mean, it's not really some hidden thing. It's like it's not a controversial issue, I don't think. because it just describes a kind of banking structure and system that is associated with them. Yeah, here's so Eustace Mullins apparently is aware of it, but it's in Trajan Hope. It's not a controversial thing. Quigley says that at the Versailles Treaty in 1919, Germany versus the Allies, all of these meetings in the peace conference itself and the political leaders were assisted by groups of experts, interested persons, and sometimes they were self-appointed. Many of these self-appointed experts were actually members of the international banking elite. So what happens is the wars happen, and then after the wars, there's post-war reconstruction and debt appropriation. So the purpose of the wars is actually to put the nations into debt for the next several generations, according to Quigley. What comes out of World War I? The first attempted Fabian Socialist International structure known as the League of Nations. So the League of Nations was intended to be this original socialist governance structure for the world. All the members and the people supporting and founding this, the very groups that we're talking about right here that you just read in Quigley, this International League of Nations is itself a Fabian socialist institution. So as you see, it comes out of the Paris Peace Conference. This is what we're talking about. This is the Quigley's page 271. And with Woodrow Wilson, there you see it is explicitly a Fabian socialist institution. I don't know why people would even argue with me on this. It's not even controversial historical facts. It's like when I talk about these facts, oh, is it the Fabians running everything? The Fabians? It's an ideology of socialism that's reformed Marxism. Well, but you won't talk about the Middle Eastern. It's part of their worldview. Like those things are not antithetical. Do you not understand that? Like Lord Rothschild and his crew are helping to set this up, you idiot. The treaty with Germany made by the Council of Four dealt with various committees and disagreements, etc., ironing them out. The chief disagreements were about the size and nature of the German reparations that would be paid. So it's all about putting Germany into debt and controlling them. The nature of disarmament and the structure of the League of Nations. All coming out of World War I. Also, I said, excuse me, by the way, I said World War II, and I think I should have said World War I in regard to the Bank for National Settlements, or I've stuck this note in the wrong page. I thought the BIS was a product of the Bretton Woods system, but maybe I have this backwards, because I haven't looked at this material in many years. But the BIS is the International Central Bank of Central Banks. So it's the Federal Reserve model, modeled on the Bank of England, modeled on the Bank of France. That Federal Reserve model is also the BIS International model. It's all the same, and it's all the same type of institution. But let's see if this... Okay, yeah, I'm right. So this is 1930. Okay, no, its initial purpose was World War I reparations. Okay, so it does come out of World War I. And who is it facilitated by? Even publicly, it tells you right here. The Rothschilds.